I turn it over to Reagan Humphrey to introduce our guest speaker for today.
Sure. So today our guest speaker is Dr. Günter Hörmandinger, who's the Deputy Executive Director at Agora Verkehrswende, which is a joint initiative of the Mercator Foundation and the European Climate Foundation. Before starting that position in 2019, he worked at the European Commission's Directorate General for the Environment for almost 20 years. His work has focused on the environmental effects of transport policy, including the adoption of vehicle emission standards. He also served as an EU environmental policy diplomat in Washington, D.C. from 2010 to 2014. And as a consultant in London as well for new vehicle and fuel technologies. His expertise in sustainable mobility can be our foundation for learning about this sector of the EU Green Deal. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it on to Dr. Hörmandinger.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, very kind. So quick question, Bruce, how much time have I got? What's your planning?
It would be good if you could spend the next 20 to 25 minutes speaking, and then we would like to discuss with you via questions and answers.
Okay, so I may be jumping over a few slides and we can do the rest in the Q&A. So let me see whether I can release my screen here. Do you see that?
Yes, we do.
Okay, all right. I go into presentation mode. I hope this is also seen by you. So thank you. A little text here in the corner bottom right is the name of our organization, which was carefully chosen not to be pronounceable in English. I'm sorry about that. So Verkehrswende means transport transformation. And we're the second such organization in Germany. We're young, we're just 5 years old. And the first one was called Agora Verkehrswende, which is the energy transition, which is a think tank specializing on transiting the energy system to zero emissions. And transport is sufficiently different from energy that our founders decided that they would found another organization, and so that's us. And I'm going to talk about the topic you see, the Green Deal, some details from that and focusing on transport. But in order to do that, I want to give you a few general remarks on the EU generally first, because otherwise I think it's difficult to appreciate what actually happened. So, so this is the EU, and I'm sure you've seen all of that, 27 member states. And just a little time ago, a year ago, that chart would have shown 28 member states. It's 27 now. As you know, Brexit, the UK has decided no longer to be in the EU after a somewhat questionable process. But let's put that behind us. Maybe some of the slides I'm going to show still show 28 rather than 27. That's because I've downloaded them from the European Commission, and I think they haven't gotten around to update all their slides yet. So it's 446 million people, almost 500 million. It's a huge market and it's a huge space. And it's the result of a succession of treaties. So it's a funny beast, the European Union. It's not quite a country. It has aspects of a country, but it's not really a country. So in 1952, after the impressions of the Second World War, the first community was founded, the coal and steel community, basically to control energy and to control the steel industry, which was a war-relevant industry. We've come a long way since then, 2 communities later, and then reinventing the whole thing as the European Union, successive treaties named after the cities where they were signed. And now we have the Treaty of Lisbon, which is the most recent one, 2009, which made the European Union what it is today. And so it's more than just a multilateral treaty, but it's a bit less than a country. It's something in between, but it has aspects of things that normally only a country has. It has a governing structure, even though it doesn't quite have a government, obviously. And this slide shows the institutions of the EU, quite a few of them, but I want to focus on the ones marked on the top. So there's the European Council, which is above all the others, because that's the ultimate seat of power in the EU. That's the place where the heads of state and government come together, 27 prime ministers who make the ultimate decisions. They are basically, these people are the ones who have signed the EU treaty. So that's where everything else comes from. And just below, you see a box called the Council of Ministers, which is the same thing, but just one level down. So the people who meet there are the ministers, the energy ministers or the agriculture ministers or the transport ministers, depending on the topic. And so they represent the interests of their member states, 27 of them, and there is an administration to support them. And to the left, you see the European Parliament. That's directly elected. That represents people, citizens across the EU. And to the right, you see the European Commission. And if the EU were a country, then the Commission would be the administration, the government. So this is the executive branch. There's also one commissioner, each from each of the member states. So there are 27 commissioners all in all, and they have a bureaucracy that works for them. So when somebody like me, I used to work for the European Commission, which means I was a European civil servant working for the European Commission. And we'll hear a little more about them. You see more institutions here. I don't want to go into all of them. Just to note that on the left side in the middle, there's a Court of Justice. So since the European Union is capable of setting itself laws, there must be a court to adjudicate. And that's the Court of Justice, which has supreme jurisdictions in the EU and is therefore overrides decisions by the national Supreme Courts. I think I'll skip this. Maybe you've seen the lady at the bottom, Mrs. von der Leyen. She's the current president of the European Commission. And I'm jumping straight into something pretty complicated. Don't worry, I'm not going through all the details. You probably can't read any of this. This is the organigram of, or the flowchart of how the EU makes laws for itself. And that's very different from the way in which, for example, the United States would draw up legislation, because in the United States, it would be a member of Congress who puts forward a bill. And then that bill gets debated in both houses of Congress. And in the end, a joint legislation is drawn up, and that's coming to the table of the president who will sign it. Not so in the EU. Only the European Commission can actually make proposals for legislation. It has the monopoly of making proposals. Neither the European Parliament nor the Council can make proposals. And that's, one could say that's a major source of power for the Commission. They have the right of initiative. If they don't propose anything, there's nothing to debate for the other institutions. And the Commission can not only propose legislation, it can also withdraw it. So if it has made a proposal and then that proposal gets picked apart by the other two institutions, beyond recognition, the European Commission may just say, well, that's not what we wanted, and we just withdraw, and then there's nothing to discuss. This is known as the nuclear option. You never use it, but everybody knows it's there. So it's quite a bit of influence. And typically what happens, so the Commission makes a proposal and it goes to the other two institutions, the European Parliament and the Council. And they enter into a procedure, which is a bit complicated, as you see, known as co-decision, which means that they both have a right to influence this. They have to agree jointly in the end. And it's quite a task if you have two institutions that are different and represent very big interests to agree on an identical text when they've been discussing it separately, because they will make numerous, sometimes hundreds of amendments. And so those two versions that come out of those two institutions will generally not be the same. But in the end, they have to agree on a common version. There's a procedure to do that. And maybe we discuss later how that can happen. But that's the general scheme of things. The Commission makes a proposal, Council and Parliament decide on it. Here's the Commission again. I wanted to show you an organigram, except I couldn't find one of the current version of the Commission. So instead, this is a screenshot of their online webpage where they show, where you can search basically for all the departments. And this is the beginning of a list. All I wanted to show you is it's a pretty big list, 56 departments or executive agencies. The Commission is basically like a government. And the Directorate Generals, which are the main chunks out of which the Commission service is made up of, they're basically ministries. So when it says, for example, some way down the list, Directorate General for Climate Action, DG Klima. That's the climate ministry of the Commission of the EU, basically. And there's an environment DG and one for the internal market, etc., etc. So they're basically like ministries. A bit on the history of the Green Deal, which is what brought us together today. I'm not going through all the history, it's far too much. Just to notice that the year 2019 was, at least in Europe, I would say pretty strongly influenced by a strong wave of awareness of climate change. And the fact that Greta Thunberg is depicted here is because, of course, she got very well known with her school strike, but that school strike only got as much traction as it did because the ground was ripe. The ground was ripe because people were prepared for this topic. And so in December of 2019, Mrs. von der Leyen was nominated president. She was nominated in the summer, and in December she was actually officially appointed. And when a new commission takes office, they have a mandate of 5 years, or a term of 5 years. When a new president takes office, she will want to have a program of her own, something that sets her apart. And under the impression of that climate issue all through 2019, von der Leyen chose the Green Deal as her big deal. So that's her defining feature, if you want. And that came out, if you look at those dates, on the 1st of December, she took office. And on the 11th of December, this thing came out 10 days later. If you happen to download it and look at it, it's a huge and sprawling thing. You don't develop something like that in 10 days. And indeed, when she was nominated and had her team selected sometime in the autumn of 2019, they went straight to work. So even before she was settling into office. And of course, the civil service of the European Commission, they all stay in place. It's only the political level that gets changed. And so these people were working basically day and night for 3 months to produce this. Also worth noting that 1 day later, the European Council met. Remember, those are the heads of state and government, and they endorsed the goal of climate neutrality by 2050. That's a big deal, because the European Council, when it produces conclusions, which is basically the official documents that they adopt there, it has to be unanimous. So all 27 heads of state and government endorse this goal. And that includes countries such as Poland, who were very reluctant to go that way. So that was quite a negotiation in the background. And that Green Deal contains a lot of proposals. I will show you a few of those. One of those is a European climate law. And what this climate law does, among other things, is it codifies that goal of climate neutrality by 2050. And that's a big difference, because European Council conclusions, even though they're very important, big policy documents, they're basically just that. They are a political declaration of will. They're not binding on anyone, whereas a law is a law. So that climate law from March 2020, which was proposed in 2020 by the Commission, makes that a firm part of the legislation, which is a completely different situation. And later it came up with a plan, the climate target plan, which also adjusted the climate target for the year 2030. And you saw it in the survey before. By the way, be careful about the metric. The target is measured as percentage reduction against 1990. So the existing target until recently was 40%. That was agreed a few years ago. And now it's been tightened to 55%, to below half than 1990. It's actually been agreed to 55% in the Council, but the Parliament is still holding out. The Parliament wants 60%. The Parliament is usually greener than the Council. So this, I haven't checked the news in recent days whether they've agreed or not, because I've been busy with other things, but that's the political landscape we have. And this is something that's already, I'm going to take it to go into that in one or two slides down. And then of course the year 2020 really was covered by or was dominated by the COVID crisis, by Corona. And still, the Commission found its feet again and is moving ahead with that Green Deal. This slide is not for you to be read, it's just to scare you. This is basically the complete list of measures in the annex of the Green Deal communication, which is what the Commission said it would do over 2020 and 2021. And it's a mad program. These are all legislative proposals, and not just any proposals. I mean, a lot of what the Commission does throughout the year are legislative proposals, but a lot of those are run-of-the-mill technical things. These are really political things that will really make a difference. And I've marked a few in red and highlighted them on the next page so you can read them. So one is the proposal on the European climate law, as I mentioned. One is the climate plan that introduces the target for 2030. And then there's a list of other things by summer of this year. And that includes completely revamping the emissions trading system, the effort sharing regulation. Those are tasks that the European member states have to do to reduce their emissions. Renewable energy directive, performance standards for cars, which I will get to at the end, and also a mobility strategy, which came out just in December. And I think I'll have to speed up, so I'll skip this. This is the Sustainable Mobility Strategy, which came out in December. Again, I'm showing this not because I want you to read it all, but to impress on you that it's a big sprawling thing with loads of things in there. One thing just for you to notice, the right side is copied from the annex of that strategy, which is a list of actions they want to take. And in blue, I've colored things that are done by various services, and in red, I've colored the things that are to be done by DG Move, which is the one Directorate General that's in charge of this strategy. So what you see is that there are loads of things listed that other people are in charge of and not DG Move itself. Let's talk about cars very briefly at the end. So there is this legislation in the EU reducing the CO2 emissions from passenger cars. And when you look at the black staircase in the middle of that graph, those are the limit values that are already laid down in that legislation. So it's been 130 grams per kilometer on average for newly registered cars until 2019. And then from 2020 onwards, it's dropped to 95 grams per kilometer, which is a tremendous drop. And it will drop further in 2025 by 15%, and in 2030 even further, as you see. And that's what's laid down so far. But notice the dashed black line on the right at the end. This is something that's not in the legislation, something that I've drawn in. That's my interpretation of what we need to do if we need to really become climate neutral in the year 2050. And that's because cars stay on the road for 14 years or so. So around 2035, we need to crash down to zero with the allowed emissions. And well, what does that mean? You see the bubble I've put in there, the end of combustion-powered cars. And this is just an illustration that if you change the type of vehicles that are allowed into the market, which is the top chart, the blue is electric vehicles, this is a simple example, then it will still take quite a while before this works itself through the existing fleet that's already on the road, and that's the lower chart. And so if, in this case, in the year 2035, you start selling only purely electric vehicles, it will take you almost until 2050 before the others are all gone. So there's this time delay aspect. And what's regulated is always new vehicles entering the market, never the existing vehicles. People who have a vehicle are allowed to continue driving it. So you might ask, why is this the end of the combustion engine? Can't we also just make fuels that don't emit CO2? And indeed, some people have put that forward. You see that I have low opinions of biofuels, and we can discuss later why, so I'm dismissing that straight away. But what about synthetic fuels? That's a big debate in Germany going on right now, that you might use renewable electricity from wind and solar power and use it to split water in electrolysis and use that in a chemical process to make artificial crude oil, which is then, with CO2 picked out of the air with a CO2 absorption device. If you do that, and then you make conventional road fuel out of that, and you burn that, you basically just give the CO2 back that you've taken out from the atmosphere. And so it's a carbon neutral cycle. So why don't we do that? We could continue using all our combustion engines. We wouldn't have to change the car industry. Wouldn't it be great? And there is indeed a constituency of people who are proposing that. The oil industry is proposing that, and also the supplying industry that helps building engines is proposing that. And here is the key reasons why we think this is a very bad idea. This is basically a simplified energy flow chart. The left box shows you what happens with 100% renewable power that you draw from a turbine or from a solar cell if you use it in a battery electric vehicle. So you go through a succession of stages downwards where you lose energy in the transmission of the electricity, the battery, and so on. And in the end, 69% of that energy ends up actually driving a vehicle, which is pretty good. Whereas on the right side is the alternative that I've just described to you. You use renewable power, hydrogen, artificial crude oil, refinement, and in the end you put it in an engine, and then the engine drives the vehicle. And as you see, only 13% of the entire original energy end up driving the vehicle. So in other words, to move the same vehicle, you would need 5 times as much original renewable energy. And renewable energy is a scarce commodity, at least when you have turned it into electricity. It's a scarce commodity. And also cost-wise, this would be a very bad thing. It would be very expensive. There are cost estimates about these fuels. And finally, this would not prevent the electrification of road transport from happening. So that would mean we have to build up 2 parallel energy systems, 2 parallel technologies in the car industry. It would just be madness from an economic point of view. That's the point of view of our think tank, but there are, as I said, some interested stakeholders who think otherwise. This is a big conflictual area right now. I think I'll skip this. This basically just says that before 2030, we won't have a lot of these synthetic fuels because they take a long time to build up. That's it with the slides. So I think the rest we do in the Q&A. So I'll stop my screen share. And let's see what you have. I saw your questions, and I don't think we have the chance to go through them one by one. And maybe if you feel like it, you better make an intervention here, and we see how far we get.
Günter, I would like to thank you very much. I imagine that you have worked a complete day already and are coming perhaps to the end by working even more with us. And we are very, very grateful. That was one of the better, if not the best, PowerPoint presentations in 20 minutes that I have ever heard. You worked through it very, very well. And I wrote down a half a dozen or so questions, but it is not for me to begin. We have a volunteer who will ask the first question, and her name is Ana Valenzuela.
Hello. I guess my question would be, how has like the COVID-19 pandemic affected like the projected goals? Considering people have been like traveling less this year, or I guess all of 2020 and a little bit of this year, like has that changed? Do you think it's like the goal will increase in reduction or decrease, stay the same, but the timeline will be shorter? Like what are your thoughts?
I don't think it will affect the goals at all. What it does is it affects short-term policy. Those goals, you know, they are set many years in the future. So I don't think anybody feels like adjusting those. Also, because these goals are very, very difficult to agree on politically. So people are reluctant to reopen them, at least not a lot. What the crisis is doing is manifold. One is it puts tremendous pressure on certain transport providers, especially public transport and aviation. Public transport suffers tremendously, and since we think it's a key part of the answer to make transport carbon free, that's pretty bad. So you see that public authorities subsidize public transport companies everywhere just to keep them in business so that they're there when they're needed again, when people start returning using them. The other business that's strongly affected is aviation, clearly. A lot of people discover that you can actually do what we're doing right now and have Zoom conferences rather than traveling for 2 days to meet somebody for an hour. And I think that will have lasting consequences. That said, people like to travel, and so private travel, I think, will pick up as soon as people are allowed to do it again. So it will have consequences of an economic type and partly structural, but I don't think it will change things fundamentally very much at all.
Thank you very much, Anna. And who would like to ask the next question? Don't be shy, just unmute yourself and start.
I have a question. I'm curious on your thoughts of how electric vehicles and their relationship to like grid infrastructure, and kind of if you see electric vehicles as being kind of ahead of like grid modification, if that makes sense. So switching our grids from fossil fuels to renewable energy, because yeah, there's obviously a lot of potential in electric vehicles, but if they're coming from electricity from fossil fuels, you know, where does that leave us? So I'm just curious what your thoughts are and where, yeah, how that ties into your work as well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, extremely appropriate question. And we have very active debates about this here, not least because those who want to prevent electric vehicles love to point out that, hey, all this electricity is not carbon neutral. So we've done a number of studies, and other people have done studies too, looking at what does it look like right now. And we found that at least in Germany already, with today's power mix, the electric vehicles emit less calculated over their lifetime. But it's true, they cause emissions because the electricity system is not yet fully renewable. The thing is, with electric vehicles, we have a paradigm that allows in principle to become carbon free, because we have to decarbonize the electricity system anyhow. That has to happen anyway. If we don't do that, we can forget the rest. So this will have to happen anyway. And then electrifying road transport is a way of doing this. And of course, that's a big effort, but there's no other way around, really. In terms of costs, renewable electricity is already cheaper per kilowatt hour produced. What now has to happen is the rebuild of the system, extra transmission lines, storage, extra management procedures, and so on. But there's another aspect, which is that if everybody who owns a car today owns an electric car, and they plug them all in at the same time, and all these cars charge at the same time, our distribution grid would break down. So the question is, to what extent do we need to rebuild the distribution grid? And to what extent do we need to accelerate that? It turns out when you talk to people from the grid industry, they are rebuilding their grid anyway all the time. The question is, do we have to accelerate that, or do we have to just adapt it as we go along? And in the meantime, engage in clever power management so that not everybody charges at the same time. There are ways of doing that. I don't belittle that. It's a big transition. We are reinventing road transport, but I think we are finding that it's doable, and that legislation I've just shown you, that car legislation, is transformative because it has really kicked the car industry into starting producing electric vehicles in earnest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
All right. I'm learning more and more with each of your questions, and that has me eager for the next one. Who would like to ask the next question? Just go ahead and unmute and start.
I have a small question. I just want to know whether battery technology, are they like actually sustainable, or there are like more ways to go? Since to create a battery, you need a lot of like metals, energy and stuff. So is it like the final stop to for like a sustainable mobility, or like the more ways to go forward with?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. Also extremely appropriate. Everything we build has unwanted side effects.
Mm-hmm.
Everything. And those who want to prevent one particular technology like to point at its unwanted side effects, while they like to forget about other unwanted side effects. Typically, the oil industry and its friends like to point out just how bad it is, all the lithium and all the cobalt, but they forget how bad it is to produce oil. And of course, that has its own impacts. One thing is clear, we can't just carry on as we do and build huge heavy cars and have everybody run around in a car. The planet's not big enough for that. So we need to reinvent transport. We need to organize ourselves in such a way that we don't need as much transport. And that transport we need to organize differently. We need to plan our cities differently. So, you know, so that people want to walk and that they find what they need while walking or cycling, and that they want to take the train because it's frequent and it's clean and it's safe and so on. So all these things have to happen. And then there's a residual demand for individual transport, and that we have to meet electrically. That has to be part of a bigger strategy. We can't just carry on with the paradigm we have, especially not if we think that the whole world should have a right to have the same standard of living. And it's 7.6, I think, billion people right now, and it might be 10 billion people by the mid of the century. So we can't carry on as we do.
Right.
All right.
But
I
maybe,
want to.
sorry, I didn't answer the questions directly on battery production. There is an issue about lithium production and water consumption. There's an issue about cobalt in the Congo and whether child labor is involved or not. And when you look at what the car industry does that uses these batteries, they've understood that that's a huge liability in terms of reputation. And so they start dealing with that issue. It's not automatic. I think the public pressure is there, though, to get them to find solutions. And I think you can do that if the pressure is high enough.
Thank you very much. Before we go on to our next question from one of the participants, I want to jump in with two questions. One is just an information question. We are trying day by day to learn more acronyms, and I want to ask you what MOVE stands for in the DG MOVE.
Okay, yeah, sorry, that's jargon. Actually, this is the Transport Directorate General, and MOVE is actually, so MOVE comes from moving, comes from transport, but actually the people who designed that were German, and MO is for mobility, and VE is for Verkehr, transport. So that's a bit of a contrived acronym to bring those two concepts into the name of the DG.
And my other question has to do with that dotted black line that you drew down to 0 for 2035. And last week was, I think, the second week of the new Biden administration in the United States. And it also is pursuing much more ambitiously being part of the Paris Agreement and achieving ambitious goals. And in that context, we all are thinking about how the EU Green Deal might provide us with some best practices that can also be used in the United States. And last week, General Motors announced that it wants to transform to a fully line of electric products by 2035 too. And when I saw your black line going down to 0 in 2035, I wondered if there was maybe some kind of link to what General Motors has in mind, and something that we don't see as well as you can see, including, for example, understanding that with a 14-year lifespan of a car, that it would be good to get to there by 2035.
Yeah, 2035 is one of those years which suggests itself. It's a round year, and it's also already anchored in some legislation. So this car legislation that I mentioned has a review clause. So the Commission is under obligation to review it and look at future years. And the years 2035 and 2040 are already written in the review clause in that legislation. So in that sense, the year 2035 is coming from that. And typically 5-year intervals are the typical interval when you tighten legislation like that, to give the industry time to recoup their costs in between, I guess. It was a great announcement by GM and we have a few other car companies that basically said already they would do this, and others who basically, who don't say it so openly, but who know it's coming. So this is this is pretty much happening as we speak. The question is not quite as settled for trucks, but for cars, it's pretty clear which way things are going to go. And I've spoken to DG Klima, the climate department of the Commission, just yesterday, and they're very busy talking to the Biden administration to find ways to line up and make this a smooth transition transatlantically.
All right, I have so many more questions I want to ask. If there's time left, then maybe I get to ask one more, but I would like to open it to the other two participants who haven't asked a question yet. Who would like to unmute and go ahead?
Yes, I have a question about do you have any special policies? Because people know that the electric vehicle is good, but they need there's a cost for them to change from the normal things to the electric things, right? Is there any subsidies or the allowance for the people who are willing to change their vehicles?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, there are. And that's a part of the policy mix. And in the European Union, what you find is that at the EU level, it's a natural place to regulate product standards because we have an internal market. So basically, you can only regulate product standards at the EU level, otherwise the market wouldn't work. So something like emission standards for cars is automatically at the EU level. But taxation is very much a national prerogative, and so tax subsidies are also national. And you find that each of the EU member states pursues a different policy. But the big ones all give big tax subsidies right now for people to buy electric vehicles. And especially when the COVID crisis came, it was not only a health crisis, it was also an economic crisis because lots of people lost their income or their jobs or businesses lost their turnover. And one way that the government introduced last year to stimulate the economy again was to give subsidies to all manner of things. And one was to give special purchase subsidies for electric vehicles. And right now we're talking about 9,000 euros of subsidy you get per vehicle.
Thank you very much. Chris, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question regarding the rollout of the charging stations and refueling stations across the EU that are being implemented. Are there any cities or countries where the EU is focusing more specifically on at the beginning for the end of the decade to implement these charging stations and the zero emission vehicles?
Mm-hmm. That's a mix. There is a European piece of legislation called the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive, and that is about to be revised. You might have seen in one of the slides flicking by, that's going to be tightened. So far, it's a bit of a toothless tiger, and it will be tightened to basically force the member states to build up charging infrastructure. And at the same time, there is quite a difference in approaches across the different member states, what they do by themselves. So in Germany, they've set themselves the goal that by 2030, they want to have 10 million electric cars on the road. And if you do that, right now it's only a few 100,000, you need to build up that charging infrastructure. So there is a whole budget for that. There's a process just starting. And we find that this is a tremendous challenge because something happens that is relatively new for everybody. And it goes by the name of sector coupling, which means that sectors of the economy that used to be completely unconnected suddenly become connected. One is the electricity system and the other is the transport system. They used to be completely separate. And suddenly, because of all that charging, they become intimately intertwined. And you start finding that all the numerous rules and regulations and technical standards that guide the electricity sector are totally unsuitable to build up the charging infrastructure. And all the understanding that the transport people have of where they want to get their energy from doesn't match at all the electricity system. So there's a big learning process going on right now between those two. And we will have to revise a large number of rules just to make it practical and easy to build up infrastructure. Right now it's difficult and a lot of red tape.
Our sixth participant who is not able to be with us right now, who has chosen sustainable mobility, is also trying quickly to learn acronyms. And one of them, two of them are related to this question, I think. One is called the TEN-T, the Trans-European Network. And the other one I'm still learning, and it has maybe CEF, and the third word is facility. And we were reading a little bit about that, and it also set ambitious goals for charging stations, including thinking about rural areas where they also will be needed in the future.
Yes, the Trans-European networks, that's a European policy that has been around for a long time. And it's linked to this concept of the internal market, which is the core policy of the EU. You know, if many people complain about the EU, there's one thing that nobody questions, it's the internal market, except the UK, and they left. So they now have no longer access to the single market, which is too sad. So if you want to have a single market and you have a collection of 27 member states with very different levels of development and connectivity, you find you don't have a single market because it's difficult to access remote regions. So it's one thing if you are in Belgium and want to go to Germany, it's just across the border, super well connected. But if you are in rural, I don't know, Romania, it's a long journey and you don't have the same access, even though theoretically you're supposed to have it. So that's an issue of European interest because the national governments tend to build up infrastructure with a national view still today. So all the roads connect points within that country, and there isn't enough connectivity across the borders. And that's what the, hence the name, the Trans-European Network policy is supposed to do. So it's supposed to help raise the tremendous amounts of money that you need to build all these railways and motorways and energy infrastructures. I'm not going too deep into it. It's a big beast because infrastructure is always a huge thing with lots of money going on. So the TEN-T is a policy and it determines what's known as projects of common interest. So there's a list of projects which are determined to be of European interest, which means they get European funding. And they can get European funding through a variety of channels. There is a direct TEN-T budget, which sounds big but isn't, which is basically big enough to do feasibility studies and things like that. And then there is the European Investment Bank, which gives favorable loans, which is real money. And all that money is channeled through an organization called the Connecting Europe Facility, and that's your CEF. So that's linked to the system of the TEN-T. And the Connecting Europe Facility has guidelines how they handle that money and how they disperse it and what they finance and what they don't. And these days, of course, they've set their sights also on electric charging infrastructure. So that will be one channel to finance it.
All right. I'm going to use that as a way of winding down with a final question. We in the United States also understand that the clock is ticking for climate change solutions. And sometimes we get frustrated often with our two-party system and the extent to which that leads to gridlock and not much gets done. And I want to ask how it was in that context. Maybe we can learn that with the need for unanimous decisions often in the EU, how it was that Poland was convinced to come on board, which I perceive in the United States similar to maybe West Virginia and Kentucky coming on board with the coal interest.
Yes, well, consider if you had such a policy really that you wanted to introduce and you want to persuade West Virginia to come on board, what can you do? Well, money is the answer. You have to pay them. And in 2019, in parallel with that Green Deal, another big policy chunk was also moved, and that was the EU budget for the next 7 years. If you go online, that's another acronym called the MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, which is, I think, $1,800 trillion or something. It's a very, very big amount of money. even though it's just 1.2% of the gross national income. It's capped at that. But so it's still, you know, the EU is big, so it's a big sum of money. And there will be guidelines how that budget is being dispersed. And that was discussed at the same time. So, you know, draw your own conclusions.
I want to thank you very, very much and ask you also if it might be possible for Victoria and others to use the slide presentation for their future work in our EU Green Deal project.
Sure. Yeah. So I've uploaded them for you to download and feel free to use them. They are from various sources. The beginning is from the European Commission itself. So, you know, there is a web link there where you can find these things and download them also if you want them, because they have lots more slides. And others are from studies that we've undertaken or that I've lifted from various reports, but I don't think any of them are copyrighted. So you should be able to use those freely.
Thank you very much. And I envision, after listening to this presentation today, a summit meeting between Joe Biden and von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, that could be very, very productive as the EU and the United States prepare for the COP meeting in Glasgow at the end of this year. And I think it would be good for all of us to look for a summit meeting like that. You also can look to me tomorrow for an email that will provide a list of assignments for the coming week. And as we move out of this session today, we have learned what I think are some really good best practices the EU has initiated in the past several years and longer. And I hope that we can learn from some of them as we try in the United States and globally to achieve those Paris climate goals. Again, Dr. Hörmandinger, thank you very much for joining us today.
A pleasure. Thanks for your attention.
Have a good day and a good evening to everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.